This is Ism. Season 1, The Origins of Socialism. Paris and the Making of Modern Revolution. Ideas meet power. Prologue. Revolutionary Sclerosis. Paris, 1794. No one could quite explain why there was a mountain at the Tuileries that morning, but yet there it was. An awkward heap of plaster and turf, dressed up in flowers and statues, its bulging sides looking like volcanic bubbles recently petrified. As the wind snapped at tricolor flags and the sun glinted off neoclassical busts, soldiers in parade endlessly circled this great altar to virtue, each one unable to prevent sweat from overtaking their brows or a mild grimace from exiting their tightly pursed lips. Thousands of Parisians had turned out that day, singing, dancing, socializing, and above all, spectating. For this was to be no ordinary fete. The festival of the Supreme Being would be one of the great spectacles of the Revolution, and at its center stood a slight, flat-faced man in a sky-blue coat, tricolor ribbons pinned proudly to his chest. Maximilien Robespierre, radiant with excitement, conducted choirs of schoolchildren, handed out sheaves of wheat, and led the day's processions. After hours of fanfare, Robespierre, the high priest of the Republic, began his ascent up the man-made mountain. As he passed, citizens offered warm, dutiful nods, which too often dissolved into skeptical or anxious glances once he had moved beyond their sight. At the summit, he paused before a tree of liberty and raised his voice to the crowd. Citizens, the Supreme Being has not been vainly proclaimed. He is the guarantor of virtue, the protector of liberty, the eternal enemy of tyranny. Its words echoed across the plaster valleys of the mountain, punctuated by a sneeze here, a cough over there. Robespierre pressed on. Atheism is aristocratic, but the idea of a great being watching over oppressed innocence and punishing triumphant crime, that idea is democratic. As he spoke, the wind fell slack. Flags sagged like deflated balloons. The world has changed, and we must change with it. The French people recognize the Supreme Being and the immortality of the soul. The ancient peoples honored their false gods with crimes, while the French Revolution consecrates the true God with acts of justice. Robespierre had been a legislator since the Estates General of 1789, so by now he was a master of revolutionary oratory. He could speak for hours on the virtue of virtue, the vileness of corruption, the eternal war between innocence and tyranny. At last, the ceremony moved to its climax. Great effigies were brought forward, one symbolizing atheism, the other ambition. A torch was set to them, and as the painted figures crumbled in flames, new forms emerged from the smoke. Statues of wisdom and truth, revealed as if by divine decree. Red embers smoldered around the ashen effigies as Robespierre thundered his final words. The idea of the Supreme Being and the immortality of the soul is a continual summons to justice. It is therefore social and republican. Would you find it astonishing that he is proclaimed at the very moment when the French people have declared war on tyranny? The tyrants of the earth have raised their thrones upon crime. Let us raise ours upon virtue. Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to Ism. This is What is Jacobinism? Virtue, terror, and the birth of the radical left. The Festival of the Supreme Being, held on June 8, 1794, marked the apex of power for both Maximilien Robespierre personally and for the Jacobins as a whole. In less than 2 months, Robespierre would be arrested and guillotined. Soon after, the Jacobin Club itself would be closed, its members persecuted, and Jacobin ideology largely abandoned by the National Convention. This repression was a reaction to a year of revolutionary terror overseen by the Jacobins' most radical leaders, with Robespierre at their head. In 1793-4, the Revolutionary Tribunal and the Committee of Public Safety issued more than 15,000 official death sentences, and it is estimated that another 20,000 or so may have been executed without trial, shot in fields, drowned in rivers, or guillotined in provincial squares. This was the Reign of Terror, the episode forever linked to the Jacobins in the popular imagination. Now, terror itself was not unprecedented. Europe had seen mass killings before, the burnings of the Inquisition, the massacres of religious war. What was new in 1793-4 was not the scale of violence, but its justification. For the blade of the guillotine did not fall upon heretics or infidels. It fell, in theory, upon enemies of the people. Monarchs, nobles, priests, hoarders, counter-revolutionaries, and even wavering republicans. The Jacobins claimed that only by rooting out corruption and treason could the Republic of Virtue survive. And it was Robespierre who turned that claim into law and official policy. So today, we're going to explore the history and ideology of Jacobinism. And because we're in this larger arc on the birth of socialism in revolutionary Paris, we're especially interested in the Jacobin legacy and how they shaped the early development of socialism. Many of the first socialist thinkers, from Proudhon, the so-called father of anarchism, to Blanqui, the early vanguardist, to Karl Marx himself, were all directly responding to the Jacobins as they built their systems of thought. Whether you believed they were bloody tyrants who unleashed senseless mass murder, or clear-eyed revolutionaries who understood what was necessary to bring about radical change, everyone had something to say about the Jacobins. So, to ground ourselves, let's begin with a little history and ask, who were the Jacobins? First and foremost, the term Jacobin describes a political club established in 1789 at the outset of the French Revolution. Officially called the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, the club was founded by deputies of the Estates General from Brittany who opposed the monarchy. Throughout 1789, the club expanded to include members from across France and quickly became the heart of the Republican movement before the Republic had been declared. Many of the Revolution's most famous figures joined early on, including Maximilien Robespierre, who entered the club the year it was founded. One of the earliest effects of the Revolution was the challenge to the Catholic Church, widely seen as the institution most responsible for the people's ignorance and misery. In 1790, the Society rented out the hall of a repressed Dominican monastery in Paris. The Dominicans were known in France as Jacobins, from the Rue Saint-Jacques, where their Paris convent was located, and so the name passed to the club. At first, the nickname had a slightly mocking, even pejorative edge, but the group soon embraced it, and Jacobin became their proud identity. With their move to Paris, the club began to grow rapidly. Membership was formally open to all citizens, though the subscription fees were high enough that most Jacobins came from the middle classes. Officially, the club's purpose was to discuss the debates of the newly convened National Assembly. But beginning in 1790, it organically developed a radical culture, famous for its fiery oratory and its ideology of republicanism and equality. Jacobins championed universal education, universal suffrage, and the separation of church and state. As the revolution radicalized, so too did the Jacobins. Royalist conspiracies and counter-revolutionary uprisings convinced them that tighter organization was necessary to defend the Republic. By 1791, the club had spawned a network of over 7,000 affiliated chapters across France, with a membership estimated at more than 500,000 people. This broad, organized base made the Jacobins the single most powerful political force of the Revolution, especially during its most radical phase beginning in 1792. In many ways, the Jacobin Club was the first mass political party in history. Its sheer size, coupled with its centralized coordination and explicit ideological mission, was largely unprecedented. Historians often point to the Jacobins as the prototype of the modern political party. Earlier political clubs and societies in England or the young United States had influence, but none matched the scale or intensity of the Jacobin network at its height. In our last episode on Paris 1793, the Radical City, we traced many of the revolution's most dramatic moments, from the Women's March to Versailles in 1789 to the massacre at the Champ de Mars in 1791 to the great insurrections of August 1792 and June 1793. Each of these uprisings radicalized the revolution further, pushing the assemblies toward a kind of street democracy driven by the demands of the working poor of Paris, the sans-culottes. Some of the most prominent figures who claimed to represent the sans-culottes, Jean-Paul Marat, Georges Danton, were themselves Jacobins, though they were also members of the more populist Jacobin Club. By 1792-3, the National Convention was dominated by Jacobins, but the movement was divided between two rival factions, the Girondins and the Mountain, or Montagnards. Broadly speaking, the Girondins represented the more moderate liberal bourgeoisie, while the Mountain claimed to speak for the working poor of Paris. Marat, Danton, and Robespierre all aligned with the Montagnards, and with the backing of the radical sans-culottes and the enragés, people like Jacques Roux, the Red Priest from last episode, the Montagnards launched the popular insurrection of June 1793 that purged the assembly of its Girondin rivals. The fall of the Girondins inaugurated the revolution's most radical phase, not only in the goals it proclaimed, but in the ruthless means it was willing to use to achieve those goals. The Girondins were among the earliest victims of the Reign of Terror, and the murder of Jean-Paul Marat, the scene that opened our last episode, was carried out by Charlotte Corday, a sympathizer of the Girondins, who believed that by killing the quote-unquote friend of the people, she might save the revolution from descending into needless bloodshed. With the Girondins eliminated, the Montagnard Jacobins embarked on a campaign to root out political rivals, branding them as enemies of the people. The Terror is usually remembered for the executions of priests, aristocrats, moderates, and royalists. Yet in reality, the majority of those guillotined were people of more modest means, accused of treason, conspiracy, hoarding, or corruption. Still, the Terror carried a powerful symbolic charge. It represented a rejection of the privileges of aristocracy and clergy. Radical elements of the sans-culottes and their allies, the enragés, pushed the Montagnards toward ever more revolutionary justice against those seen as exploitative, tyrannical, or disloyal. Context is crucial here. Between 1793 and 4, the First French Republic was besieged on all sides. Foreign armies invaded while civil war tore the countryside. The French Revolutionary Wars, launched in 1792, pitted France against Austria, Prussia, and Britain, all openly hostile to a republican France. At the same time, the National Convention introduced one of the first experiments in mass conscription, the levée en masse. While embraced in Paris and some other regions, it was violently resisted elsewhere. In the Vendée, where Catholic and Royalist sympathies ran deep, conscription ignited a bloody uprising that spiraled into years of civil war. These crises created an emergency atmosphere that deeply shaped Jacobin policy and gave rise to the Terror. As Robespierre put it in the now infamous speech in early 1794, quote, "If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is baneful, terror, without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy, applied to the most pressing needs of the fatherland." So this brings us back to the Festival of the Supreme Being, that bizarre ceremony declaring a new state religion which opened this episode. The festival embodied Robespierre's idiosyncratic brand of Jacobin ideology made real, its zealous commitment to republican virtue, and its awkward insistence on social unity, even if that unity had to be enforced through terror, revealed Jacobinism in its most theatrical and perhaps most monstrous form. So, where did all these ideas come from? Why was Robespierre so obsessed with virtue? Why invent a civic religion at all? And well, the short answer is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Robespierre revered Rousseau. The early historian of the Revolution, Thomas Carlyle, often described the Jacobins as Jean-Jacques evangelists and called their doctrines the gospel according to Jean-Jacques. And it's largely true. You cannot understand Robespierre and the Jacobins without first understanding the influence of Rousseau's political philosophy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is one of the most influential and controversial political thinkers in history. His work shaped the ideologies of liberals, socialists, conservatives, and even fascists. He has been celebrated as a courageous defender of liberty and equality and condemned as the intellectual godfather of totalitarianism. To grapple with Rousseau is not just to seek to understand Jacobinism, it is to try and understand the roots of modern political thought itself. He is one of those thinkers, like Hobbes or Marx, whose ideas cast such a long shadow that everyone who came after had to wrestle with them, whether in agreement, rejection, or qualification. So let's dive into Rousseau. One of the central features of his political philosophy was a rejection of the core assumptions of Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Hobbes. In his 1651 treatise, Leviathan, Hobbes argued that before governments, humans lived in a quote-unquote state of nature, a violent world of endless conflict where life was, in his famous words, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, only a strong sovereign could save humanity from this war of all against all. Rousseau turned this on its head. His book, Of the Social Contract, begins with the line, quote, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Where Hobbes saw the state as a necessary restraint on human violence, Rousseau argued the opposite, that it is corrupt institutions and tyrannical governments which produce misery and injustice. Left to themselves, humans in their natural condition lived peacefully, even harmoniously, with each other and with nature. This radical claim that humans are not naturally corrupt was hugely influential. It shaped the Jacobins' obsession with virtue and later inspired the basic premises of anarchism, socialism, and communism. The belief that if oppressive structures were dismantled, human beings could live more freely, equally, and justly. Robespierre allegedly kept a copy of Rousseau's Social Contract at his bedside. He once called Rousseau the divine man. And in Rousseau's conviction that humans were naturally virtuous but corrupted by institutions, Robespierre found both his faith in virtue and his justification for rooting out corruption by any means necessary. So, what did they mean by virtue? To us, this word sounds abstract, even moralizing, but in the 18th century, it carried a very specific meaning. It came from the ancient republics of Greece and Rome, where virtus meant civic strength and devotion to the common good. A virtuous citizen was someone who put the res publica, the public thing, above private interest. In that sense, virtue was the opposite of selfishness, corruption, and luxury. Rousseau believed humans were naturally compassionate but corrupted by inequality and greed. For him, the task of politics was to restore virtue, to insist that the public good must outweigh private self-interest. The Jacobins tried to make this their guiding principle. It is why Robespierre was nicknamed the Incorruptible. He cultivated an austere lifestyle, rejecting wealth and luxury, claiming always to put the revolution before himself. And to answer your question, no, Robespierre was not the guy you wanted at a party. He was the type who'd show up in his perfectly pressed sky blue coat, glance around disapprovingly, and make you feel guilty for drinking too much wine or having your shirt untucked. And honestly, he probably wouldn't even come. He'd be at home reading Rousseau, which, let's be honest, would be a huge relief. Only someone who'd spent the night before buried in Rousseau could come up with a line like, virtue without terror is baneful, terror without virtue is powerless. For Robespierre, virtue was the positive devotion citizens owed the Republic. Terror was its negative safeguard. The inflexible justice meant to root out corruption and defend the revolution from collapse. Put simply, the radical Jacobins believed a republic could not survive unless its citizens were virtuous, unless they placed the public good above their own private interests. And they were willing to enforce that principle at the blade of the guillotine. So yeah, Robespierre was a pretty intense dude. But in a political culture obsessed with civic virtue, that intensity made him nearly unassailable. Rousseau's most famous and controversial idea was what he called the general will. This was his attempt to solve one of the great riddles of politics: how to reconcile individual liberty with the collective good. On the one hand, people want freedom to pursue their own interests. On the other, society needs unity and laws to survive. Rousseau's answer was the general will, the idea that there exists a deeper shared interest of the people as a whole, distinct from what any one person or even a majority might want at a given moment. Now, Rousseau was always a little fuzzy on how exactly this general will was supposed to be discovered. He hinted at democratic deliberation, but often described it in almost mystical terms, as if the people could somehow speak with one unified voice. And of course, if you happen to be in the minority, your own liberty might not feel so reconciled. So while the general will was meant to solve the problem of liberty and unity, whether it really succeeded is, to put it mildly, debatable. Nonetheless, it was a hugely influential idea, taken up, reworked, and attacked by nearly every major political thinker who followed. For Robespierre, the general will was sacred. To oppose it wasn't simply to disagree. It was to betray the revolution itself. That's why the Jacobins treated opposition not as debate, but as corruption, even treason. Their obsession with social unity came straight from Rousseau. Everyone must obey the general will, or else. But in practice, there was no such general will. And so, in the end, Robespierre claimed the right to declare it himself, and sent to the guillotine anyone who did not fall in line. Interlude: The Scream of Virtue. Sans-culottism is dead, extinguished by new isms of that kind. And yet its soul lives on, working far and wide till in some perfected shape it embraces the whole circuit of the world. Thomas Carlyle, The French Revolution, A History, 1837. As the National Guardsmen approached the Hôtel de Ville, they braced themselves for barricades and pikes, for a sea of sans-culottes. They had heard the tocsin bells ringing as they marched from the convention, but the empty courtyard made it clear that Paris had not answered the call. The few sentries outside melted away or defected on the spot. When the convention's troops burst through the doors, they found no last stand, no insurgent army, only a dimly lit council chamber where Robespierre's allies sat in despair. The confrontation that followed was a grotesque parody of an insurrection. A pistol cracked. Philippe Lebas slumped lifeless on the floor. A scream then followed a crash of shattering glass. Augustin Robespierre had hurled himself from a window, his body broken on the stones below. Georges Couthon, crippled and half-paralyzed, struggled in vain to wheel himself away before soldiers dragged him from his chair. Saint-Just, the angel of death, sat motionless, his face unreadable, offering neither word nor struggle. And then came the incorruptible. Maximilien Robespierre lifted himself from the table, shoulders hunched, blood streaming from his shattered jaw. Whether by his own hand or another shot, no one could say. The man who had thundered virtue and terror into law could now only gurgle through torn flesh as the guards bound him. Dragged from the chamber, the high priest was silent at last. The next day, the machinery of terror was turned upon its masters. Large carts hauled the condemned through the streets as mobs hurled insults. One by one, they mounted the guillotine, while men and women watched from windows and street corners, some in awe, some in celebration, some in horror. The 10th was Robespierre. His face was bound in heavy bandages, his jaw barely held together. As the executioner forced him beneath the blade, he ripped away the cloth, and a piercing scream tore through the square. Then the blade thumped, and cheers were suddenly choked by gasps of pity and dread. The voice of virtue had perished, but the scream lingered, an echo now twisted into terror. Robespierre's Republic of Virtue did not last very long. In late July 1794, barely a month after the Festival of the Supreme Being, a conspiracy formed in the National Convention. Deputies, fearing for their own lives, turned on the Jacobin dictator. On July the 27th, Robespierre was denounced on the convention floor, and an order went out for his arrest. His allies in the Paris Commune tried to protect him, barricading the Hôtel de Ville. But regular troops loyal to the convention stormed the building and captured Robespierre in the early morning hours. His jaw was shattered, either by a failed suicide attempt or by a bullet fired during the raid. The next day, July the 28th, Robespierre was guillotined along with Saint-Just, Couthon, and more than 20 other Montagnard leaders. In the days that followed, dozens more Jacobins from the Commune were executed. It was one of the bloodiest political purges in the Revolution's history. In the months that followed, a white terror spread throughout France. Jacobins and their sans-culottes allies were hunted down, imprisoned, and often executed in acts of vengeance. Like the original terror, it was chaotic and uneven, but symbolically, it marked the repression of Jacobinism and the crushing of the popular movement that had once driven the revolution forward. The next period of the revolution is often called the Thermidorian reaction, a sharp turn away from Jacobin ideology. But Jacobinism was simply too big to erase overnight. At its height, the club had 500,000 members, and many of the very deputies who conspired against Robespierre had once been Montagnards themselves. Jacobin ideals could no longer be professed openly, but their influence lingered just beneath the surface. It was in this atmosphere of repression and reaction that we see the direct connection between Jacobinism and early revolutionary socialism. Gracchus Babeuf, whose trial served as the epilogue of our last episode, is often remembered as one of the first communists. Later writers have also called him a socialist, even an anarchist. These terms did not exist in Babeuf's own time, but his calls for radical democracy and the abolition of private property foreshadowed much of what would come to define left-wing politics in the 19th century. Babeuf is most remembered for his Conspiracy of Equals, an attempted insurrection against the Directory in 1796. He wanted to install a revolutionary government dedicated to equality of wealth and a, quote, community of goods. But for all his radicalism, Babeuf was still, at heart, a Jacobin. Like many of them, he criticized the bloodshed of the Terror, but he also applauded Robespierre and Saint-Just for at least trying to achieve real equality rather than merely declare it. In the years after Thermidor, a circle of egalitarian Jacobins gathered around Babeuf and his conspiracy. Their plot was betrayed by an informer, and Babeuf was executed in 1797. But their ideas would outlive them. The Conspiracy of Equals became a bridge between Jacobinism and the revolutionary ideologies that followed, socialism, anarchism, and communism, especially in their most radical and insurrectionary forms. In Paris, the first generation of revolutionary socialists, the first people to actually call themselves socialist, would emerge in a milieu still shaped by Jacobin memory. Gracchus Babeuf himself was both a proto-communist and in many ways a neo-Jacobin. As we'll see in our next two narrative episodes on the revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871, neo-Jacobins and revolutionary socialists often came together to form the radical edge of left-wing politics. Early vanguardists like Auguste Blanqui carried forward the Jacobin commitment to insurrection, but in a more conspiratorial and elitist form. Reform-minded socialists like Louis Blanc criticized the Terror and pushed instead for peaceful state-led reforms. And early anarchists like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon admired the Jacobin passion for equality, but condemned their centralism and authoritarianism. All of these early socialist currents lived under the shadow of Jacobinism. Whether they embraced it, rejected it, or tried to rework it, they could not escape its legacy. And that legacy leads us directly to Karl Marx. For the rest of today's episode, I want to explore how Jacobinism shaped Marx's thought, and how Marx, in turn, reinterpreted Jacobinism for the modern socialist movement in a way that would profoundly influence leaders like Vladimir Lenin. Like other theorists of his day, Marx had to wrestle with the Jacobin legacy. Much of his political writing dealt with French history, from his works of the 1850s, The Class Struggles in France and The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, to his pamphlets on the Paris Commune of 1871, the Civil War in France. For Marx, France was the laboratory of revolution, and the Jacobins were at the center of the experiment. First and foremost, Marx characterized the Jacobins as the epitome of bourgeois revolutionaries. Now, coming from Marx, this might sound like an insult, but it was more complicated than that. He saw the Jacobins as limited by their class position, yes, but also as a world historical force. They smashed feudal privilege with ruthless energy and cleared the ground for a new stage of history. And this brings us to the foundation of Marx's worldview: historical materialism. Now, I'm not going to unpack all of Marx's economic theories here. That would be an entire season of ism on its own. But we do need to understand how his framework shaped his reading of the Jacobins. Historical materialism, in short, is the idea that history moves through conflict between social classes. This is that famous quote from the Communist Manifesto: "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Marx believed that beneath the speeches of great men and the drama of revolutions, the real motor of history lay in the struggle over economic production, property, and power. And this was a truly revolutionary way of understanding the past, and Marx really knew his history. He spent years holed up in the British Library, chugging coffee, chain-smoking cigars, and poring over historical tomes. And out of that intensive self-study, he began to see history in a fundamentally different way. And like many of his radical contemporaries, he had a particular fascination with French history. For Marx, the French Revolution wasn't just a sequence of dramatic events. It was a case study in historical materialism. So when Marx looked back at 1793, he didn't just see Robespierre at the Festival of the Supreme Being, or heads falling under the guillotine. He saw a class, the rising bourgeoisie, using the Jacobins as its political mask. What looked like a republic of virtue was, in Marx's eyes, really the final triumph of the middle class over the aristocracy. For Marx, the sweeping away of the feudal order was a necessary step in humanity's development. Without the Jacobin terror that dismantled the medieval Ancien Regime, feudal structures would have continued to choke off capitalist growth. And this might seem kind of strange if you're new to Marx's thought, but even though Marx never stopped being capitalism's greatest critic, he always insisted that capitalism was a necessary stage of history. And why? Well, because for Marx, capitalism was both brutal and revolutionary. He never tired of denouncing its exploitation, but he also marveled at its dynamism. Capitalism unleashed unprecedented growth, tore down old hierarchies, and transformed society in ways no previous system ever had. Marx once wrote that the bourgeoisie had, quote, accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, or Gothic cathedrals. And he meant this. But for him, all that progress was only a prelude. The same forces that capitalism unleashed would eventually set the stage for socialism through the struggle between capitalists and workers, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Put simply, Marx admired how the Jacobins used every means necessary to push history forward. But he also saw their terror as limited, the violent birth pangs of a bourgeois order. The real drama, the truly universal revolution, would only come with the next act, the socialist revolution. Marx's complicated relationship with the Jacobins did not end with him. Once Marx became the touchstone for socialists worldwide, later revolutionaries returned again and again to 1793. Most famously, Vladimir Lenin openly cast the Jacobins as revolutionary ancestors. Lenin took inspiration from the fierce revolutionary commitment of the Jacobins, sharing Robespierre's intense disposition and penchant for ruining parties. Like Robespierre, Lenin would argue that terror was necessary to transform society. Now, whether Lenin's revolution was really a faithful application of Marx's ideas, or whether it was even genuinely socialist, has been the subject of endless debate, and we will come back to those questions in future episodes on Marxism, Leninism, and the Russian Revolution. What matters here is that the Bolsheviks self-consciously embraced the Jacobins, seeing themselves as heirs to their methods. That inheritance, the idea that a disciplined revolutionary minority could seize power, wield terror, and remake society in the name of the people, shows just how much the legacy of Jacobinism would endure. And Jacobinism is still even debated today amongst leftist intellectuals, perhaps most famously by the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek. Žižek is one of the best-known radical thinkers alive, notorious for his dense philosophical detours, politically incorrect provocations, and his seemingly contradictory self-description as a, quote, moderately conservative communist. The point of such contradictions is to unsettle. Žižek's whole shtick is forcing us to question the categories we take for granted about politics and ideology. Among his many provocations, Žižek has defended the Jacobins, insisting their embrace of terror was not simply bloodthirsty excess, but a sincere attempt to remain faithful to the radical promise of equality. Unlike Marx, who saw Jacobinism as a bourgeois revolution that history would inevitably surpass, Žižek provocatively suggests the left today should recover something of the, quote, Jacobin spirit, decisive, even ruthless action against exploitation, especially in an age when liberal democracy feels paralyzed by endless compromise. Central to this is Žižek's obsession with ideology. He argues that ideology isn't just what we consciously believe. Drawing on psychoanalysis, he insists ideology is the subconscious framework of assumptions and rituals that structure our everyday lives. And here he famously twists Marx. Marx once wrote, quote, "They do not know it, but they do it," describing how ideology tricks people into reproducing domination. Žižek flips this around, saying, quote, "They know very well what they are doing, but still they are doing it." In other words, under late capitalism, we are no longer naive. We know our sneakers are made in sweatshops, that politicians are corrupt, that climate change is real, but we go on as if we don't. Ideology, for Žižek, doesn't blind us. It lets us see clearly while still participating. For Marx, the problem was false consciousness, not knowing. For Žižek, it is cynical ideology, knowing full well but still playing along. And that's why Jacobinism matters to him. It dramatizes the tension between the dreams of collective freedom and the danger of new forms of domination. Because Žižek insists that the dream is still worth fighting for. So, when he calls on us to recover the, quote, Jacobin spirit, he's not asking us to, guillotine our neighbors. He's reminding us that in a world where everyone knows the system is broken but keeps pretending otherwise, the real radical act is to stop pretending. For Žižek, ideology never disappears. Even revolutions risk becoming new chains. Now, there is no greater critic of authoritarian socialism under Stalin and Mao than Žižek himself. But still, he insists that the only way forward is not to retreat from politics, but to push through its contradictions. And that's why, with his usual irony, he suggests perhaps what we need today is not fewer Jacobins, but more. Now, of course, there is a danger in overly romanticizing this Jacobin spirit. The reality of Jacobin rule was that most victims of the terror in 1793-4 were not aristocrats or great enemies of the Republic, but ordinary people caught up in suspicion and repression. That tension between the dream of emancipation and the violence it unleashed is what continues to make Jacobinism both inspiring and terrifying. For the Jacobins were nothing if not frightening, and that is in fact what makes their legacy impossible to ignore. So, the Jacobins remind us of both the power and the peril of trying to make politics absolute. For the Jacobins were the first to imagine politics as total, the entire social body reshaped in the name of equality. That legacy of ambition, terror, and contradiction has haunted every revolutionary moment since. The Jacobin Republic of Virtue collapsed in blood, but their spirit, uncompromising, disciplined, and obsessed with equality, refused to die. It lived on in Babeuf's conspiracies, in Blanqui's plots, in Marx's theories, and in the revolutions of the 20th century. And as Slavoj Žižek reminds us, perhaps it still lives on today, wherever we recognize the system is broken, but keep pretending otherwise. And in our next narrative episode, we will see how Jacobins and socialists once again took to the barricades in Paris in 1848 to try and build a new world free from domination. So join me next time for The Red Flag in Spring.
Du bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien cool, les dents de série.
Ism is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the Ism Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.